Hello, my friends. I spent this Saturday afternoon going through Washington's newly announced national security strategy and the related noise coming out of Europe, Ukraine, and the media ecosystem that has enabled this disaster. When you strip away the rhetoric, a very clear picture emerges. The United States is trying to back out of its failed Ukraine project without admitting defeat. Europe is being told to grow up and rearm, and Russia is being positioned not as the villain of the story, but as the reality that the West must finally deal with on grown-up terms. Let's start with the New York Times, because whenever Washington wants to change the narrative, the Times obligingly lays the groundwork. The paper has now discovered that corruption in Ukraine is Zelensky's fault. After years of cheerleading for Kiev and pretending this regime was some shining democracy, they suddenly claim that after a brave investigation into Ukrainian corruption, they have concluded that Zelensky sabotaged U.S. and EU anti-corruption efforts. They tell us that Washington and Brussels, in their infinite wisdom, created supervisory boards and anti-corruption structures to protect all the money and weapons they were pouring into Ukraine. Then, supposedly, Zelensky and his circle bypassed those boards, stacked them with loyalists, left seats empty, rewrote company charters, and removed guardrails so that hundreds of millions could be spent without outside oversight. Hundreds of millions? Let's be honest. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars blown through an oligarchic wartime kleptocracy. Why is this story appearing now? Because someone has to take the fall. The same Western elites who armed, financed, and politically shielded Kiev now need a scapegoat for a war they are losing to Russia. Yermak is already in the crosshairs, and the next step is to pin the whole systemic corruption problem on Zelensky. When the New York Times turns on you, you are in real trouble. They aren't doing this to tell the truth. They're doing it to manage the collapse of their own narrative. Now to the centerpiece, the new U.S. national security strategy, a 33-page doctrine that sets out the Trump administration's foreign policy line going forward. On paper, some of it reads like America first. In practice, it looks like an attempt to reorganize priorities after the Ukraine adventure has failed, while preserving room for a future confrontation with Russia and China once the West has rearmed. Region by region, the document breaks down like this. No more lecturing about ideology, pure transactionalism. Washington wants to deal with governments that have resources and are ready to do business, not listen to sermons. That's an admission that the old values talk is exhausted and that the West is now competing directly with Russia and China on practical terms. Even the document essentially admits it's complicated. Translation: the U.S. has no coherent strategy, is overstretched, and is desperately trying to manage crises it helped create. A mix of cooperation and confrontation, especially with China. Beijing is identified as the primary competitor. Washington wants to contain it, but also recognizes it must work with it. That is the classic mark of a declining hegemon. It can't afford full confrontation, but won't accept parity either. Here is where the mask slips. The document quietly acknowledges that the U.S. should get along with Russia. Project Ukraine, in their own coded language, needs to be wrapped up. They talk about avoiding further escalation in Europe and list normalizing relations with Moscow among core U.S. interests. That is effectively an admission that the war in Ukraine has failed to break Russia and is instead wrecking European stability. Brutal, if you read it honestly. The strategy says Europe has lost self-confidence, has mismanaged relations with Russia, wrecked its own economy and society, including through uncontrolled migration, and is staring at economic decline and even civilizational erasure if present trends continue. In 20 years, the document warns, Europe may be unrecognizable. Washington's message is clear. We are tired of carrying you. You broke your relationship with Russia and your own economy in the process. Fix it. Well, the U.S. declares it will prioritize its own hemisphere, a Trump-era corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. That means less appetite for open-ended commitments in Europe, especially while Europe refuses to carry its own weight. The document opens with a symbolic line.
The era of the United States, propping up the entire world like Atlas is over. That sounds good to an American domestic audience, but it also signals something else. Washington wants Europe to rearm, pay for its own security, and free up U.S. resources so that after a pause, the West can take another crack at Russia and ramp up the confrontation with China. Reuters reinforces this interpretation. It reports that the Pentagon has told European governments they have until 2027 to get their defense posture in order without relying on the U.S. as before. 5 officials close to the administration reportedly confirmed this timeline, even though Reuters can't say it's formal White House policy. Europe, for its part, is begging for more time until 2030 because it simply doesn't have the weapons, the industrial base, or the intelligence capabilities the U.S. possesses. Realistically, they won't recreate U.S. capabilities by 2030 either. But the intent is obvious. Washington wants Europe to spend massively on arms, primarily buying from U.S. defense contractors, while the U.S. pivots toward China. In the background, European hawks are already talking about 2029, 2030 as the window for a second round with Russia, preferably with America, fully on board. The Pentagon's 2027 deadline tells Europe, you have a few years to build up your forces and prepare for that confrontation, and you won't get a blank check from us forever. This brings us to the reaction in Europe itself. At a Doha security conference, Christian Amanpour confronted Kaja Kallas with the U.S. strategy document, noting that it essentially frames Europe as a problem and enemy in some formulations. Kallas, desperate to spin this, claimed she read it as the U.S., affirming Europe as its number one ally and merely urging Europeans to be more confident and take responsibility for their defense. She clung to one line that Europe lacks confidence and turned it into a love letter about alliance unity. But the reality described in the document is harsher. Europe has mismanaged its relationship with Russia, allowed itself to be dragged into an anti-Russian crusade that wrecked its own energy security, and now lacks the means or will to climb out of the hole. Washington is angry, and Russia, for its part, is watching Europe sink deeper into crisis while strengthening its own alliances and industrial base. Alongside the strategic reset, Brussels and the G7 are doubling down on economic warfare against Moscow. They are now weighing a ban on the so-called Russian shadow fleet oil tankers moving Russian crude outside the Western insurance and price cap system. Reuters notes that roughly 1/3 of these tankers have links to companies based in Greece, Cyprus, and Malta. The EU and the G7 want to cut those ties, targeting their own shipping sectors to stop them from operating Russian-connected tankers. At the same time, the EU is moving toward the last card it has left to keep Ukraine afloat, seizing Russian frozen assets. Hungary has torpedoed Ursula von der Leyen's backup plan of issuing Eurobonds to fund Kyiv, refusing to sign up for joint debt that would funnel more money to Zelensky. So Brussels is left with one route: confiscate Russian state and related assets held in Europe and channel the proceeds to Ukraine. The UK, ever eager to prove loyalty to Washington, has announced it is ready to hand over around £8 billion of frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine if the EU moves first, with roughly €140 billion. London reportedly has around €20 billion in Russian-linked assets on ice, including both state and private holdings. Belgium still resists, but Sweden steps in as the model vassal. Stockholm is redirecting hundreds of millions in aid away from Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Liberia, Bolivia, and other countries, and sending that money to Kyiv instead. Sweden's message is clear. The periphery can be sacrificed. The Ukraine project must be funded. This is economic self-harm on a historic scale. Confiscating sovereign assets shatters trust in Western financial systems, accelerates de-dollarization, and confirms to the rest of the world that Western property rights are political, not legal. From Moscow's perspective, this simply validates the move to build an alternative financial system with partners in the global South. From the rest of the world's perspective, It confirms that Russia has been right to decouple from Western institutions. While the West ties itself in legal and financial knots, Russia is waging the war it chose to fight: a patient, systematic dismantling of Ukraine's military and economic capacity. A recent large-scale missile and drone strike hit energy infrastructure and military targets across Ukraine, plunging major cities back into blackout conditions. Kiev no longer has effective air defenses. Western stockpiles are depleted, and the systems already delivered to Ukraine are being attrited faster than they can be replaced. Kiev, in turn, launched a drone at a commercial high-rise in central Grozny, Chechnya, a purely civilian target. The Chechen leadership has promised revenge, and you can take them at their word. This kind of action does nothing militarily. It simply reinforces Russia's determination, hardens public opinion, and makes any future settlement harder. Inside Kiev's power structure, the knives are also out. Rumors multiply that Andriy Yermak is preparing to bolt. The anti-corruption agency NATO is reportedly ready to release more audio tapes, Operation Midas, a not-so-subtle reference to golden toilets and oligarch excess which directly implicate Yermak. Officially, Zelensky has banned him from leaving Ukraine. Realistically, when people at that level decide it's time to disappear, they disappear. NATO is said to be preparing formal notices of suspicion. The CIA-backed war on corruption is becoming a war on yesterday's favorites in Kyiv. And then we get a surreal twist. Yuri Ushakov, one of Putin's top aides, gives a deliberately provocative interview in which he remarks that Jared Kushner has become very useful in discussions and hints that Kushner may be instrumental in drafting a Ukraine peace plan. Putin, he notes, has already met Kushner in a friendly atmosphere multiple times. Is Ushakov trolling? Absolutely. But the very fact that Moscow can half-seriously frame an American political princeling as a future architect of a Ukraine settlement underscores how badly Western strategy has collapsed. The people who sold Ukraine as a great moral crusade are now floating back-channel, face-saving exits. While all of this unfolds, the intra-Western rift over speech and control surfaces through another front. The EU's attempt to bring Elon Musk's X, formerly Twitter, to heel. Brussels has slapped X with a fine of around $140 and $150 million under the Digital Services Act, claiming the platform is not transparent enough and mishandles its blue check system. The real issue is that X has been less willing than other platforms to submit to EU censorship demands, especially on narratives about Ukraine, Russia, and broader geopolitical issues. You won. As politicians like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio have publicly blasted the EU's action as an attack on American tech and on free speech. Elon Musk himself has declared that the EU should be abolished and sovereignty restored to nation-states so they can actually represent their own citizens. It is no coincidence that the EU's censorship push comes at the same time Washington's own strategy document labels Europe a declining civilization on the road to erasure. And just as Europe is being marched into economic warfare against Russia that is ruining its own industries, vassals sometimes thrash around to show they still matter. Washington can and will put them back in line when needed. Put all of this together, and a coherent picture emerges. The Ukraine project has failed on its own stated terms. Russia has not been broken. It has adapted, rearmed, and deepened non-Western alliances. The Western narrative is cracking, hence the New York Times suddenly discovering corruption and pinning it on Zelensky, and the EU scrambling to seize Russian assets to keep the lights on in Kiev while Sweden cuts poor countries off to feed the war machine. The new U.S. strategy publicly deprioritizes Europe, even as it pressures Europeans to rearm by 2027, and quietly signals that normalizing relations with Russia is in America's interest. Europe is in structural decline by Washington's own admission, economically, demographically, civilizationally, and is being asked to pay the price for a confrontation with Russia that primarily served Anglo-American geopolitical ambitions. Inside Ukraine, the regime is fragmenting under pressure. Energy systems smashed, air defenses running on fumes, internal corruption wars escalating, key players like Yermak eyeing the exit, and the leadership reduced to symbolic drone strikes on Russian civilian targets that accomplish nothing. From a Russian perspective, all of this confirms that the course set since 2014 and decisively in 2022 was unavoidable. Moscow faced a NATO armed bridgehead on its border, a regime in Kyiv kept alive by Western money and intelligence, and an alliance structure that refused to accept Russian security concerns. By forcing the issue, Russia has exposed the fragility of Western economic and political structures, especially in Europe, and accelerated the emergence of a multipolar order. The United States is now trying to reposition itself, claiming it will no longer be Atlas, demanding Europe rearm, talking about getting along with Russia and ending the Ukraine conflict, without ever admitting that it miscalculated. Europe, caught between its own decadent elites and Washington's strategic retreat, is paying the highest price. Deindustrialization, demographic stress, political fragmentation, and the real risk of civilizational erasure that Washington's own strategy document bluntly describes. Ukraine, tragically, is the immediate battlefield where all of this is playing out. But the deeper story is the end of an era in which the West could dictate terms to Russia and the rest of the world. That era is over. The sooner Western governments accept that reality and negotiate with Moscow on the basis of facts rather than fantasies, the sooner this war ends and the less catastrophic the consequences will be for Europe itself.